just so you know, there's no question that fire can be incredibly devastating to the landscape. When you look up here and you see all these trees and shrubs and the devastation that occurred here, okay, it shows just how destructive fire can be. So there's no denying that fact. We know that fire is a destroyer, okay, but fire is also a rejuvenator, okay, and fire is important. Fire is an emotionless thing, okay. It's elemental in nature, and so therefore it has no favorites, okay. So whatever happens, things just exist, okay, and fire does what it does, sparing nothing, okay. But a plant's ability and the ecosystem's ability to recover shows resilience, okay, and resilience is very important in an ecosystem. Like, for instance, if we look right up here, you see these pine trees, okay. There's some that are dead, some that are still standing and doing quite well. Those are Table Mountain pines, just like what we saw over at Eagle Rock, okay. Now if we look right here, this is a Table Mountain pine as well, okay. This Table Mountain pine is a new one, okay. This is new growth. This one wasn't here before the fire, and because of the fire, the Table Mountain pine above us, okay, and it's all around here. Here's some that got cooked, okay. They dropped their seeds after or during the fire. Their cones opened and the seeds landed on the ground and have since germinated. And so there's quite a few of these, and this is a really healthy one. So this Table Mountain pine is going to replace the ones that have been burned and killed by the fire. So it's really remarkable that this plant, it depends on fire. So fire is very important in the ecosystem in certain areas. And this ridge here, because of its location and topography, and because of the plant community here, is very resistant to fire. So even though we see this catastrophic damage that has occurred here, it doesn't mean that the ecosystem is destroyed, but rather it's just providing opportunities for other things to be able to come back in and recolonize and carry out their life cycle as they would before the canopy developed on the trees. If fire had not been withheld from the landscape, it would be interesting to know what this community would be like without trees, and if fire was part of the normal ecological schedule here. It would probably be quite insightful to see what this is actually supposed to look like as opposed to what it looks like right now. So if fire was a regular part of this landscape, the question would be, what would this look like in here? And the answer is, right now, we don't know, because fire has been withheld from the landscape for so long. The communities have changed ecologically speaking, and it makes it really difficult to understand what the full impact of fire is in this particular forest community. But what is interesting is to see the resilience of many of the species in here and what shows up after the fire has gone through, which tells us, based on these plants' ability to bank seed, that the seed may have been here for a very long time and was just waiting on the right opportunity to germinate based on needing something catastrophic like a fire. And you can see how the fire has really devastated this area as far as the herb layer. I mean, there's just a few things that are starting to grow on the herb layer, but look at all the trees that have died as a result of this very hot fire. We'll talk a little bit more about how fire behaves when we get further up on the mountain. So look at this area here. See how bleak it is. And it got really hot here. Burned a lot of the duff layer off and exposing the rock and the mineral soil underneath. So this again gives you an idea of the heat of the fire on some of these exposed points. Fire, as far as the way it moves, on flatter areas down in the valleys, it generally doesn't move that fast, and therefore doesn't move quite as, or doesn't burn quite as hot. Okay, but as fire moves upslope, because wind tends to blow upslope through a process called orographic lifting, the wind tends to drive the fire up the hill. And as that fire moves up the hill, the steeper it gets, the greater the opportunity for things to get caught on fire. And with all the rhododendron and mountain laurel that's in this area, fire was inevitable because those plants are very volatile and burn quite well. Okay, but as we move through here, you can see the amount of devastation that occurred. There's some blueberry growing in here. Here's a little sassafras. Actually, look at here. You can see here's our baseball bat and our catcher's mitt and our first baseman's mitt. So 3 different leaf types all on one plant. Pretty neat. Okay, but you can still see the remains of some of these dead trees and stumps and things like that in here. So really devastating when we just first glance. If you're just looking at this as a first glance, you'd say, oh my gosh, this is really devastating. This is horrible. Okay, but then look at the mountain around. Okay, you see green, you see trees that are leafing out. So it just shows that fire is not a complete killer. It doesn't completely devastate the landscape. Rather, it provides opportunities for other things to come in. So it really shows that we should change our view on fire, okay, and think of it more as just a thing, more of an elemental thing that has advantages and disadvantages, but it just is and will be. And that's an important thing to understand and recognize when we're looking at fire and its role in the ecosystem. Another look of all the devastation in this particular area that burned so hot. We move our camera around, we can look back towards Cedar Knob. The east side of Cedar Knob got hammered as the fire went marching up through there. And back over on Round Top, the north facing side of Round Top got cooked as well. That occurred on November 11th. It was a Friday, and the fire had really begun to advance and it had laid down in the valley for a while and was moving across the side slope of Rumbling Bald, and then it joined up with what was burning over on the north side of Rumbling Bald, and that combination of things began to work its way up the valley, down through there and around the side of the mountain, and went up over the top of Cedar Knob and Round Top. And that was the day when things started really happening, and people started, at least firefighters, started worrying a little bit that it was going to get down into Chimney Rock Village and start burning houses. So there was a lot of protection that was being done by firefighters to make sure that houses were safe and didn't burn, and a lot of work was taking place to protect people from the fire. There was evacuations of the town, and it got pretty hairy there for a little while. And then some of the backfires that were started off of Highway 6474 in Chimney Rock and Bat Cave, they began to work their way up the mountain to meet the main fire and began to slow its approach. So that was a good thing that worked out the way that it did. But had we not got rain at the time that we did, and humidity levels hadn't begun to go back up, that fire could have been much more devastating than it was. Even as large as it was still not as bad as it could have been, given the situation. Okay, so these are some of our dwarf irises. If you remember in the Buffalo Creek Park video, we saw dwarf crested iris. This is dwarf spring iris. This blooms in hotter, drier areas up on tops of ridges, and it is not as shade tolerant as the dwarf crested iris. So it really likes these ridge tops where it's exposed, it's dry, and gets plenty of sunlight. So these are mostly on their way out. These are just about finished. Okay, there's still a few left that are still looking quite nice. But dwarf spring iris. Okay, so here we got a little shrubby vine called yellow honeysuckle. Okay, yellow honeysuckle is another one that likes these dry ridges and places like that. And this is another species that tends to proliferate after fire. There's quite a bit of it scattered around up here. You see some down there, okay? But it's a really nice plant. This is also one that is considered to be a rare species in North Carolina. It's a watch list species, which suggests that its numbers or its habitat is not certain. So that means its status, its management status is difficult to ascertain. And because it doesn't occur that frequently, it makes it questionable as far as how well it does. But it seems to be that this plant does tolerate fire, and that's why we're seeing some of this around here, because of fire moving through the landscape here. Pretty cool. I haven't seen this plant in a while. There used to be some of this over at World's Edge. It's at Chimney Rock in the attraction part of the state park. So I always get excited anytime I see this species because it's really attractive. Okay, so this grass-like species you see here, this is called white iriset. White iriset, or Cicericium dichotomum, is a federally endangered species. Okay, it's also a state endangered species. But interestingly enough, Hickory Nut Gorge contains probably the greatest numbers of it anywhere in the state. Now that's possibly debatable, and there may be some biologists that would correct me if I'm wrong, and they can certainly do that if I am wrong. But it's scattered all throughout the gorge. You can find large populations over at Chimney Rock, at Sugarloaf Mountain, even down on the bottoms of Round Top Mountain. So it's pretty prolific in the gorge, but it's a disturbance tolerant plant. So it likes disturbance. So the fire would have probably been a good thing for this plant. In fact, we haven't really noticed any significant decline in the white iriset population following the fire, or at least here at Rumbling Bald. And this is an area that I've spent a lot of time monitoring, doing counts and inventories of this plant. Now it'll be another few weeks before this plant blooms, okay? But it's rather intriguing. In fact, it's got these little white star-like flowers that have recurved petals. So it's rather interesting, but the blooms are so small, most of the time it doesn't get a lot of attention. It's called Cicericium dichotomum because it has what's called dichotomous branching. Okay, so we've seen dichotomous keys and how it uses a two-pronged questioning system to key out plants. This branches dichotomously. Okay, when we start looking at some evolutionary things, we will look at dichotomous branching in as far as classification systems and things like that. But it's a really interesting plant. It likes these old road beds. In fact, there's quite a bit of it scattered around in this area where we're standing. This is one of the bigger populations on Rumbling Bald. Of course, you have to actually look around to be able to find it amongst all the other green things that are in here. But it's here, believe me. And there's some right here. There's another little clump. So it's just scattered around here on this old road bed, which would have been the kind of disturbance that this likes. You'll find it on banks and slopes and places like that where disturbance has occurred. If you're just looking at this and didn't know any better, you would think these were irises. And you'd be close because iris, these are in the iris family. Okay, but this is white irisette, and these are some of the healthiest ones that I have ever seen. And I think this is probably due to the nutrients that have collected here in the soil thanks to the fire. Because this is right where the fire burned. Didn't burn really hot here, but it did burn here because there are remnants of the fire. But again, because this plant likes disturbed areas, it's not something that's going to be bothered too much by the fire. But I've been counting these up here for a long time, and I have never, ever seen the leaves quite as large as what they are on the white irisette up here this year. So it's really quite unusual. So a bit of a surprise, a pleasant surprise, because it shows me that the population up here is doing quite well. And I'm not sure when the last time it was inventoried. May have been when I was over here inventorying with some of the state park folks. So who knows? But needless to say, it's doing quite well. Okay, so some pretty neat stuff up here where we're at right now. This little flowering plant's called wood betony, or lousewort is another name for it. Okay, this is also an area that burned really hot. Okay, so there's a lot of dead trees around, but the vegetation here is a little bit different than what we saw at the other place. It's a little bit lusher here, a little covier, so to speak. There's probably some amphibolite in the rock here, so the species that are up here are a little different. That's partly why we saw the white irisette earlier, because it likes that calcium in the amphibolite. This shrub here in front of me, this is called wild indigo or false indigo. It's a bush or shrub that is really prolific up here. I'm actually kind of surprised to see how much of it there is up here. And so again, this appears to be a species that's quite tolerant of fire and really benefited from having fire go through here. It hasn't bloomed yet, but when it blooms, it'll have these long clusters, these long spikes of really deep purple flowers, or indigo colored flowers. So it's a really nice shrub to have. Some people grow them and put them in their yards as an ornamental. That's how nice they are. They're generally short-lived though, and they don't live a long time. So these will grow for a little while, and they'll get kind of tall, and then they'll die back and then regrow again from their root crowns. But pretty interesting. But there's a lot of it. It's all down the trail here on both sides of the trail. Here's some more of the yellow honeysuckle. Okay, but this is a really neat spot here on the trail as we're walking along. I'm quite amazed by the amount of growth in here, and this is all good stuff. This is positive signs that there was benefit from the fire. I'm not seeing a ton of invasives. We've seen a few. I've seen a tree of heaven or two and some princess tree, but generally, for the most part, things are looking pretty good up here as far as invasive species, and things are recovering quite nicely, such that unless you just look really hard and see the dead trees and the burned trees, you would almost not realize that the fire had gone through here. There's some fire pink down here, so pretty cool. Right, so this is flame azalea. This is one of the darker red ones that I've seen. It can be very variable in color, anywhere from yellow to a really deep reddish orange color, and this is one of the more reddish ones that I've seen. But check it out, it's pretty cool. It's got these really long stamens, and there's typically 5, okay, and then a long pistil to go along with that. If you'll notice about these, they don't have the very distinct nectar guides that you'll see on some of the rhododendrons, but it doesn't mean that they're not there. We just can't see them. If you look at that top petal in the center of this flower, Okay, it's kind of got some yellow in it, and it's got that strong red line going down to the center of the flower. That's where the nectar guide would be found on this. Now, you would have to have ultraviolet light to be able to see it, but for the insect that pollinates this, it would be able to see it just fine. Okay, but this is flame azalea, one of a handful of azalea species that we have here in Hickory.